Today we're going to be talking about trenching excavation. And I noted right before we got started that some of you are actually doing this job, so you should be able to identify a lot of what we'll talk about here. These are the things we're going to accomplish today. We're going to cover the scope of the standard, the application, and definitions. The reason you need to be aware of it, we don't list everything in our presentations as far as the scope and everything, but you always need to look at those to ensure that you're falling within that particular standard. Because some people get confused very easily about it. And then sometimes they'll add definitions in there just to help you understand exactly what they're talking about and stuff. We'll go over some specific excavation requirements as well to include a protective system as well. And we have quite a few good photos in here. Now, I do want to point out some appendixes, which these are listed in the back of the particular section, which is subpart P. The main thing you need to remember about these is some are mandatory and some are not, but it will specifically state that it's mandatory in the appendix if you have to follow it. But when this standard was put together, they felt that these were very important, which if you don't understand how to classify soil, then you need to take some courses in order to be able to do that. And there's several that you can take. And you can also invite us to come out and do some training for you as well. Now, we don't get very deep into soil classification, but there are some great videos showing it as well. And some of them are located on the federal site. Um, and you can follow this link right here that I'm going to place in here. And they have two of them that specifically address how to classify the soil along with sloping and benching as well. And most people don't use timber shoring anymore, but a lot of folks use what I call uh, the box um, of the trench box and provide that protection. But many times what we see is problems with that. So these will help you along as long as you're going through reviewing these and stuff. Now, there are some definitions, as I mentioned earlier, and excavation is exactly what it says right here. We've kind of shortened it a little bit and put it in there. Trench is typically the same thing that's listed here as well, and a protective system is what you're trying to do to protect the people who are in that particular area, and so forth on these right here definitions as well. Now, the tabulation table for any trench box or other types of boxes similar to that, you must have that tabulation data on site to ensure that you're following it. Because how else would you know uh, what forces can be put up against the side of that particular box or that excavation site that's got something similar in there? And here's the definitions, and I'm not a slide reader, so you can read through these and take a look at it. And you'll note in the particular photo right here, there's definitely some issues right here as far as the folks standing in there without any type of protection. Now, this is something that you see in every standard that OSHA has. A competent person should be able to identify everything that we're listing right here as far as trenching and excavation goes. That includes other situations as well. For example, hazardous atmospheres uh, that can cause people to pass out once they get down in there due to lack of oxygen and stuff. That competent person must also be able to classify the soil. Now, most people will tell us that you're only doing, you're treating all soil like sea soil. Well, you still need to understand the characteristics of the other one as well to make sure that you are complying with the standard. Whatever protective system you are using, then that person should be able to discuss it and uh, appropriately take action if they see something not going the way it should go. So that's the main thing you need to remember here about competent people. And there's many times we will come up to a job site and we will start asking questions and the person can't answer some of the basic questions as well. And there's where you run into trouble. Now, here's a little information about the weight of the soil. 1 cubic foot typically weighs 110 to 140 pounds. There's a lot of different, depending on the type soil it is, depending on the moisture that's soaked in there, in addition to that cubic foot. Now, they have a yard listed on here as well. The reason I relate to this to folks is keep in mind when you take a front end loader and drop a load of dirt in the back of your pickup truck, it sits that bed down. And that's within that little small area that can crush somebody. Now, does anybody see anything wrong with this particular photo? Anybody want to chime in on this? And this is typically what we run across when we're out on a job site. All right, you've got no protection anywhere in there for that particular person that's down in there. At least they do have a ladder down there to put the person out. And Mr. Artie got it right. That's an example of what we're talking about. And we drive up on these quite a bit. And we see these, and that's what makes a compliance stop officer to have to stop and take a look at the job site. The reason they're doing that is to protect the people in there. And a lot of people think that they're just being harassed, and they're really not. They're there to protect you. Um, and Mr. Will got the other one right there. Now, cave-ins is the biggest thing that can happen. I'm not sure if very many of you remember the one that happened a few months ago right here in Garner. They were on an excavation site digging up next to the roadway, and uh, the um, surveyors, I believe it was, got up next to the edge of the bank, next to the road, and the bank collapsed in on them. Luckily, one person was far enough away that they didn't get any injuries or anything, but the other person died as a result of it. Now, there's numerous other hazards within the standard that you need to remember as well when you see these or think about these out there. Uh, Oxygen. Is there a lack of oxygen? What type of products that might be down in there as far as fumes go? Here's a gasoline engine in this particular photo, so you might be giving off a lot of CO as a result of that. And people become incapacitated down there. Water accumulation is something else that you need to watch out for. Machinery next to a trench or excavation site as well, because the vibrations of the machine or roadway can cause it to collapse. And then you've got to also consider underground utility lines to include not just gas lines, but power lines as well, or cable or fiber optics. So you want to make sure you have it tested to see if there's any type of um, underground utilities there. One of the other things a lot of people forget about though is falls. All right. Does anybody remember what the fall height is for construction? All right. We got a couple of people saying 6 feet. Absolutely. Remember, you can fall just as far in an excavation or a trench as you can fall off the top of a building, is what we're looking at here. And most of these injuries and fatalities take place between 5 and 15 feet in depth. And typically there's no warning sign whatsoever. And this is a good example of what we're talking about. Now, when you're when you're looking and inspecting these right here, this is where you need to pay attention as well. You'll note that you got 2 feet of an individual up here. Remember, that could be a 6 foot fall down in there for that particular individual and stuff. So there's where you're looking at the surrounding sites as well. Now, I do want to give you some information that is on our website to help you do the inspection whenever you do go to a job site. And it's got a lot of good information in it as well. And I encourage you to download this. It's Industry Guide 14, and it deals with trenching excavation, and it gives some really good examples in there to use as well. Um, but keep in mind, you can't remember everything, but having the material there, reviewing it, and looking at the site will also help you as an inspector or that competent person. Now, as we go through the standard, we'll also go through each one of these sections. So, um, so that you'll understand why these are important. I want to send out a couple more links before we go through this section, which one of them is I mentioned the federal folks earlier on their website. If you go to the federal site, up in the search engine at the top, type in videos, and it'll bring up all the videos that the federal folks have on their site. And they have some that is in Spanish as well to help those folks. WorkSafe BC is another site that has a lot of good videos and stuff that you can use to help get your people trained on some of the hazards they may see whenever they're out there. Now, the federal site has also, you can take a look at the fatalities at the federal site or serious injuries at the link that I'm fixing to send right now. Um, and when you review this, you'll see that these have like 922 fatalities that had taken place since 2007. So this is some good information whenever you're talking to your folks about what can happen to them if they're not being careful out there. Now, these are some additional sections throughout the standard. So if you're looking for something and you need to know, well, do I need to do an inspection of this site? If you go to this part of that standard, um, you can see what type of inspections you're required to cover and stuff. The same way as walkways right below there as well. Now, here's where we're addressing that job site a little earlier, where we're talking about you want to prevent hazards from taking place. Something that a lot of people don't see is the hazards that are within a photo. And it's not because they haven't seen it, but they're not understanding what's going on sometimes. And you can see how tall this bank is up along here. Um, but you also see how this is not sloped in. And then, how about this big rock right there? What's the odds of that rock rolling down there and striking the individual? Those are things you got to consider when people are in a trench or an excavation site. And here's where we're addressing the underground utility line. Does anybody know who you're supposed to call before you start digging? There we go. Everybody's got that. 811. And have any of you ever called that and they haven't showed up before? Just curious if anybody's ever run across that. All right, I take it that nobody has. I actually have when I was supervisor in an apartment community, and we were going to dig up the line for the rain gutter that had plugged up somewhere underneath the dirt. So we had to call them to come out and survey the area to determine if anything was in there. We didn't think it was, and they didn't show up on the date that they're required to show or scheduled rather. And so consequently, we called them again because we didn't want to start digging unless we were absolutely sure about it. So typically, you got to call and get that surveyed before 24 hours before you start digging. Typically, they're really good about getting out there. But The one that I'm talking about with me was a very long time ago, but they're even better today about getting out there to look at it and determine if you need to do anything. Now, keep in mind that if you are digging up next to utility, so regardless of what it is, you're going to have to support it as well once you dig the material out from around there and stuff. And you want to dig it very safely. A lot of people are not aware, but when you go to their website, they actually have a little manual you can download. And the manual talks about how you dig up to the underground utility as well. Because you certainly don't want to be using a pick and there's a high voltage power line buried there, or a gas line buried there. But the little guide they have, you can download and use whenever you're out on a job site to show how you dig up next to it, because you certainly don't take your backhoe and dig all the way up next to it. Now, there's also, and I want to send this link to you, and a lot of people don't realize what we actually use to look at whenever we are doing inspections and stuff. This is a compliance directive, and the compliance directive number is CPL 02-00-087. And this will pretty much tell you what we will be looking at whenever we show up on a job site. And this will help you at determining that as well. You always want to make sure you can egress a trench or an excavation site. And keep in mind, you need to provide that at 4 feet or more. All right. And it's got to be within 25 feet of where the people are working in there. Now, if I have a, say, 100-foot trench, I'm drawing it on here, and this is 100-foot total. All right. How many ladders am I required to have in that 100-foot? Anybody tell me? Don't be afraid to say or ask or whatever. All right, Mr. Kevin is the one who got it. Remember, you can't laterally travel no more than 25 feet, so you may need either 3 or 4 in some cases, depending on how it's laid out. All right, but 3 would typically be the right answer. But what a lot of people don't realize is the ladders are very important. You always want the ladders right next to where the people are working. The reason for that is the person can gain access to it fairly quick, and if the ground is caving in around them, they can actually use the ladder to help pull themselves out with it as well. And this is a little diagram of what we were just talking about. I threw that 100 feet in there to see how many would get a little confused about it. But this gives you an example of where between the ladders is actually 50 feet. So we're still good to go, but always place as many ladders as necessary. Because remember, if you only got one and you got um, 10 people working down there, then you may need more ladders. But these are the minimum standards, and you can always do better than the minimum standards. All right, what do y'all think of this? Let me see some responses on this right here. Any good things to say or any bad things to say about it? There we go. Yeah, well, this was a job site that our folks in the compliance stopped by. The trench and everything looked pretty good, but are you really trusting the excavator in this particular photo on the weight load that it can support? And that's definitely not looking good. The other thing you got to consider is how close to roadway. But these are basically railroad ties down here underneath there. And that requires an engineering approval to be able to drive across this. That meant that an engineer can tell you how much weight that particular railroad tie would be able to substantiate. And remember, the excavator is digging at the same time, but this is what will really look bad. And we've got numerous examples of this, but you don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure that there's something wrong here. Now, hauling um, loads is another thing you got to be concerned about. Now, that includes material and stuff as well. And along the edges of this bank right here, you can see the ground is sloped back some, but what you do notice is the material can very easily roll down in there, or if a piece of equipment is sitting something down into the site, then you need to be clear of the area where it's going in case something happens and they accidentally drop the load. So you got some other additional things you need to pay attention to here. Um, Whenever equipment is being operated at a site, like for example, this dump truck right here, if they're loading from the side, swinging around this way, they're okay. If they're loading from the back, it's okay. But if you're loading over the cab, then there has to be this protective barrier up here for the cab. Otherwise, the dump truck operator must get out of the piece of equipment while it's being loaded. And this is specified in the standard as well. And this particular dump truck would not have adequate protection if they were loading from the front or crossing over the cab with the load. All right, early warning signs is basically the same thing we are seeing out there. You got a fence up here, you got a person directing the operations that are going on, or if the equipment is being operated within that area where it can fall into the trench, then it has to be guided in there by some way. And one of the ways is if you back the dump truck up. Let me go to this previous photo. If the dump truck is backing up, you can put stop logs out here and it will stop the dump truck from backing completely up and stuff. But in this case, in this particular photo, everything's gone wrong in this one. And there wasn't a competent person on the job site. Now, the atmosphere is very important. And this is throughout any of the standards that you see where it addresses the atmosphere. The oxygen must be between 19.5 and 23.5. Combustible gas concentrations cannot be greater than 20%. Then, if you're using some type of material down there, whether it be glue or adhesives or anything like that, you're going to have to pay attention to the permissible exposure limit as well. One of the things we have seen in the past and people don't think about is jackhammering in rock or breaking rock up down there so you can lay the line or level it out. Now you're generating silica dust, which now has a standard as well. So pay attention to the permissible exposure limits for folks. There is some additional guides I want to send to you. I can get my mouse, come over here. Now, there's one on protecting workers, and here's a guide for it. It's also available in Spanish. That's a poster that you can post around your job site, and it's publication 3215. It's something that can help you remind people of things. And there's a fact sheet dealing with trenching excavation as well. And I'm providing this information so you can use it to tell your folks about. And that publication guide for trenching excavation safety is actually uh, 3476. And it's a good guide to be able to use. And it gives you this information in there. Because if we walk up to you and ask you what is the oxygen um, concentration down there, you should be able to tell us. And anytime you suspect an atmosphere of 4 feet deep, something can be in there, and you're required to test the atmosphere. If we walk up to a job site and we see that it's over 4 feet, there's a question we're going to ask. Did you test the atmosphere before you went in there? Zachary, no, that's not considered a confined space on trenching excavation. That's a common question we get an awful lot. Uh, if you're doing trenching excavation, you fall under that standard. If you are climbing into, say, a manhole in the excavation site, which there should be a demonstration coming up in a little bit, um, as soon as you enter the manhole, or better yet, the pipe that is down in there, say you got a 6 foot sewer line that you're laying and you go inside that pipe. As soon as you go inside that pipe or that manhole, that now falls under the confined space standard and you can be cited under it versus under trenching and excavation. So here are just a few of the examples of what we're talking about on hazardous atmosphere. Emergency rescue is very important. People do not take this serious enough. Just because you're on a job site and you can use your phone or your radio or whatever, keep in mind you may be in an area where cell phone service isn't so good, especially the way things have been being built in North Carolina lately. When you dial 911, they may not even know where you're at. You may not even know where you're at when you dial 911 in order to get rescue equipment to come out there. Now, if you are doing in-house rescue and you suspect there's a hazardous atmosphere, then you're going to have to provide training and everything else on how to use the equipment and everything in order to be able to get someone out of there. And you've got to be able to practice that as well. So just don't think 911 shows up, they can help you either. Many times they may have to call a specialized team in there. Or if they feel it's been too long since the person's been buried, then it just becomes body recovery at that point. Now, water has a tendency to accumulate. We had a fatality a few years ago over at NC State where water was constantly in this excavation site, causing the soil soak into the soil and causing the soil to cave out around the trench box. We had the individual walk up there to go put the ladder in the trench box to start their work, and the ground on the outside of the trench box gave way, and the individual fell in, and the dirt fell over on him. And by the time the firemen and EMS responded, it was too late. The individual was determined there was going to be only a body recovery in that situation because they were having trouble digging down to where the individual was at. So pay attention to what type of situations you got going on. If you're pumping the water out, is it still accumulating beneath you? And that competent person needs to pay attention because they're required to inspect it. Several places you'll see in the standard where it says to inspect it. But many of them don't say you have to document that. So keep that in mind as well. But there are certain standards that do require you to document that as well. So just don't think you're out of the boat by one thing. Um, and now let me ask y'all, what do y'all see in this particular photo? Soil pile too close. That's a good one, Mr. Zachary. There you go. Mr. Steve hit the nail on the head. You got people who are obviously walking over there not caring about one little thing, and you haven't got that area guarded off as well. Remember, whenever you're digging a hole in the ground, if somebody walks over there from the general population and they fall in there, they can go back to trying suing you for that. So you need to barricade, and that's what Mr. David just pointed out, that barrier off when work is being done. But what I do want to point out to y'all is there's an individual in there, and there he is right there. You can see the top of his hat. And so we have some other issues there as well. So keep that in mind when you're looking at something. Look at the bigger picture and stuff. But y'all hit the nail on the head, so I'm glad y'all did that. And here's that close up of that particular individual down in there. How deep would you estimate that to be? Is the question. How would you know when we walk up there? This is a compliance photo. When we walk up there, how would we be able to determine how deep it is? Let's see. Yeah, no hard hat. Mr. Will pointed something out very important here. Is the person 5 foot or 6 foot? There's, I'm going to mess your name up, but Sati, I may have messed it up and I apologize. But a trench rod is another way of measuring it, but that means you have to get up next to it. All you got to do is say, listen, folks, would you mind coming out of there? Because this is hazardous. You don't have a trench box coming in there. And once you get out, you can measure the individual to determine how deep it was. So be very careful about using a trench rod though, because if you walk up next to a trench or excavation site, um, it can cave away on you as well. So be very cautious about how you get up close to one of these. But another hazard in this particular photo is the soil pile. Soil pile has to be what? What does the soil have to pile have to be? I'm testing some of you competent people I don't know you know the answer. Not just moved away. There's a specific thing. There we go. Mr. Steve got it. 2 feet. That includes material and everything else. Nothing can be within 2 feet of the excavation or trench site. You guys are on the ball. If you're digging up next to a building or another type of structure, it's got to be supported to prevent it from caving in. This is what we will be looking at when we're on the job site and stuff as well. If it's suspected that you're to get very close to a building, you may have to get a structural engineer involved to determine how you can stabilize the material and everything of that particular structure and stuff. And this is kind of what we're talking about right here. Don't think that a building will not give away on the side, because especially once you get over here where the footers and everything are at as well, that's where you're going to have to bring that structural engineer in here. And remember, this is the part of the standard where you're required under 1926.651 to protect the people whenever they're in there. And when we're talking about protection, we're talking about here, this rock up here. You may run across other situations where you may have dirt that has been wet, like clay, and then it dries out, and then it becomes like almost a rock at that point. And if those little small pieces can roll down in there, same thing applies. Where are you putting the material around it as well? Because don't think a piece of material. Where are you putting the material around it as well? Because don't think a piece of material won't run down in there. In fact, I was on a job site over at NC State. As we were driving up, the compliance officer and I, all of a sudden we seen this small 2 by, I'd say 5 feet piece of concrete culvert start rolling right across the job site. And Luckily, nobody was standing in the area where it was rolling, but if it would have been, they could have been seriously injured right there as a result of it. So make sure you pay attention about the material and everything. Now, these are some examples of what can happen, and it shows you what you want to look for. Like if you dug the bank like this on both sides today, you come back and got a bulge or fissures up there, then you need to reassess that there's something going on here. What can we do to prevent this from occurring and stuff, which typically would be a trench box. All right, the protection of the people is what we were just talking about right here on this particular part of it. There's nothing can be up close to that trench. The whole reason they want that 2 foot down along here is if something does roll down off this bank, it's going to hit that 2 feet before it rolls on in there. And that's to help protect the employees that are down inside that area and stuff. So keep in mind that if you pay attention to what you're looking at, you can see potential hazards taking place. And don't think that you won't come across one or two. And this is a little illustration of what we're talking about, that 2 feet. And you want to watch how you set material, especially culverts and other things. If they're laying down, sometimes people will put them stacked on top of each other. Well, that's just waiting for something to start rolling in those particular cases and stuff as well. So watch out for that. There is a publication, another publication that you can go to, and I'll put it up here to link for you. Um, it's OSHA publication 2226, which is dated 2015, and it highlights a lot of the elements that you need to know in this particular standard and to be aware of on cave-ins and stuff. Um, Here's a great example of what we were talking about. All right, as long as these folks are outside that manhole, they don't fall under the trenching excavation standard. But we don't have 2 feet over here either. All right, those are things that you will see. Now, going back to the confined space, as soon as that person climbs into that manhole, they just broke the plane of that and they're considered to be in a confined space at that point and stuff. And the other thing I wanted to point out, how clear it is whenever they're doing this work, they're using some kind of adhesives down in there. There's where your permissible exposure limits may exceed when they're using a product because you may not have very much wind crossing the area and stuff. So as a result of that, there's where you're going to run into those problems. Now, inspections are required, as I mentioned earlier. There's nothing in the standards that says you have to document it, but we are going to ask when the last time you inspected it. You're required to do it each day prior to each shift that's starting to work. And if there's rain, snow, hurricane, anything taking place, you're going to have to re-inspect it. Let me ask you something. How many of you are aware, would there be a difference between digging like today versus say a couple of months from now? Is there a difference between like if I was to dig a trench site today and I wait another 2 or 3 months, it becomes cold. Is the soil going to have different characteristics? All right. Absolutely. There's where we're going to start running into different characteristics. The ground can be frozen and causes moisture and everything, and therefore causing a bigger hazard at that time, or becomes more stable at that time in some cases. So watch out for that as well. Um, Here in the standard, everybody that I've taught in my last 12 and a half years with the state do not realize you must use some kind of protective system at 5 feet or more, and it's got to be approved by a competent person. There's where you run into that situation. Now, what's the other two methods outside of a trench box being used that can be considered? Does anybody know what those other two things are? Kind of. There we go. Mr. Steve pointed it out. Sloping and benching, that's an acceptable method as well. But is that challenging as well? Because let's say we're going to dig a 10-foot trench, all right, here in the ground. This is going to be 10 feet, all right. How far do I have to slope this back for, let's say, sea soil? Does anybody know off the top of their head? I'm really testing everybody because I'm not getting any answers. All right, Mr. Terry said 20 feet. Does anybody go along with what he says? All right, we're going, say, 6 feet deep. I didn't add that input in on it, but just throw that out there. Mr. Zachary pointed out the angle and stuff. What it is for every foot down, we are now required to go a foot and a half back. So that 10 foot can turn into a very, very big hole, is what I'm trying to get. There's where you can do that little calculation in your head. But keep in mind, those are listed in the standard as well. And that little industry guide I told y'all to download a little earlier, that will help you remember that because many times we'll show up on a job site and we will ask that question. What's the slope angle that you're sloping the soil at? All right. Or if you're doing benching, same thing applies. And if the people can't answer the questions, they're not a competent person. All right. And y'all got it right on the nail. Sloping and benching is an acceptable motion. Of course, in this particular photo, there ain't no sloping hardly in there. So you need to make sure you understand that the people are put at risk. Now, I do want to point out in this too, is there's a piece of equipment down there that these folks are operating in this particular situation. So you're going to have to be taking a look at the atmosphere as well. So because of that running equipment. A protective system, and this is a little close up of the excavator on there. Do not overload the trench box as well. If you're using a trench box, the sides of this here on the top was not meant to support that much weight and stuff. And you can use these little guides that I've been passing out to you um, to help you understand that. Because one of the things we're going to ask is what's the tabulation table for that particular trench box? And can you put that load on there like that? And if they can't answer the questions, they haven't got a registered engineer involved. Now we got a situation where you're going to end up getting cited for several things. Now, insulation removal is pretty much the same thing. If you've ever done one, you can see how it goes in there as far as making sure people are doing the right thing. You may have to stack trench boxes on top of each other, or you may have to put an excavation site down using the columns and everything that come with it. And then you just follow the manufacturer's instructions on it. And that's the best source of information that you can use. Now, in this particular one, what's the hazards? I want to ask y'all to take a good look at it based on what we've been talking about. What would be some of the hazards? And you're not going to embarrass yourself if you don't know. Trust me. All right. Mr. Zachary says exposed to sidewalls of trench. That's a good one. Um, got the soil pile too close? Absolutely. That's a biggie. One of the things, and I think, yeah, yeah, Steve's got the trench box along the bottom. A lot of people don't catch that. You cannot be more than 2 feet off the bottom, because the soil may be heavy enough to collapse in around it. And that's a real good one. What's one more issue that a lot of people miss here? Well, yeah, you got a piece of equipment down there, but nobody's running it right now. But we will be asking questions about that. There's something that a lot of people look at and don't realize more than anything else. Ladder, yeah. Well, the ladder's important. And remember, anytime you're using a ladder, it's got to be 3 feet or more above the place where you're exiting, unless it's secured. Come on, folks. I know you got one more thing I want y'all to think about. Yeah, but they weren't climbing into that. Well, to be honest with you, sometimes they do that. We would ask that question. But here's something that you don't think about and people don't think about. All right, some trench boxes may have a brace down here too. All right, depending on what type of trench box, what type of load's going to be put on this right along here, you may need another brace in there to protect it from collapsing in on someone. So that's something you don't think about. When we ask to see the trench box tabulation tables, it will tell a person that. So everyone's got the good answers on what they're saying. Just pay attention to what they're doing and how they're doing it and how they're using that particular trench box and stuff. Now, I don't need to say too much about this particular one right here. A lot of you will see this right here. Here at soil pile number one. Well, at least they got hard hats on. Uh, but what's missing in this photo that we were just talking about? There we go. Mr. Steve got it. All right. No ladder. How are they getting in and out of there? That's a good question. And that would be a question we would ask. How are you getting in and out, or watch you come in and out? And that's when we'll get a picture of it and stuff. All right. Soil classification. We're not going to get too involved with this because it's really a hands-on type of thing. But the Appendix A will assist you at determining what the soil will be. The videos that I was just pointing out on the federal site, I'll send you the link. And just keep in mind, the videos are actually pretty good on the federal site. It talks about how to classify the soil, and I've added the link in here with you as well. And they walk through it very well. And remember, once you train your people on how to do that, you need to occasionally ask them about it as well, to make sure that they understand how to classify the soil and stuff so they don't forget. But if you're doing this trenching excavation thing an awful lot, they should be familiar with this and learned it over the years from folks and stuff. That's the only way going to be able to do it. Um, but make sure you're telling them the right information. And I'm not going to read all of these to you because the presentations are available to you and stuff. So here's what cohesive soil is basically talking about. Granular type of soil as well, and it goes into where it doesn't uh, stay together very well, basically. Uncompressed soil. Let me ask y'all this. If I go to a job site and I dig the ground up and that ground's been there for 1,000 years, never been disturbed or anything, would that soil be fairly stable? What's y'all's take? Mr. Will says yes. And come on, somebody else. There we go. Mr. Steve said yes. Yes, it will. Believe it or not, people don't realize this soil's been collecting there for thousands of years. And when you dig into it, even sea soil is pretty stable at some point. Um, but if you're going into an area that has been disturbed before, now you need to understand what the soil is doing. And everything under Appendix A will tell you about it. Some of our photos on here will show you different things. Like in this particular one, you got different soil mixed in. And don't think you won't run across A soil over C soil or C soil over A or B. You may run into situations where, based on the angle of the dirt, say A soil, you slope it here, you might have to tilt the slope more, and then you might even have to tip it more if the soil is different on each one of the heights that you go down to that type of soil and stuff. So B soil is basically similar as well. And like I said, I'm not going to read all these to you because you can look them up. Sea soil is typically your most dangerous soil. It doesn't coalesce very well, and it's sort of like going to the beach digging in sand. I know many of you have done that before, probably went to the beach, dug down into the sand, and it's pretty stable. But any type of vibration or anything can cause that collapse. And we've actually lost people as a result of digging and burying themselves in the sand sometimes. And we had a fatality this summer in North Carolina on the beach. I'm trying to remember. It was a kid that was there, if I recall, and I can't remember the age, but the soil gave in and collapsed around him. And unfortunately, before they could get him dug out, he passed away. And here's another good example of the different levels. Now, here's benching going on over here on both sides. So this is a situation where you're running across different, you'll notice different color layers of the sand, or not sand, but soil and stuff. All right, that pretty much covers everything on the presentation we're going to cover, but I do want to send you one more link. This is on the federal site that will also address a lot of cave-ins and other things. These are the videos I was addressing, but there's a lot of other videos. If you intend on showing videos to folks, be sure you're showing them the videos correctly. Whenever you're training someone, you can't just use a video to do that training with. You've got to go out there and do hands-on training as well. Like we can come in and help you with the standard training and make sure questions are answered. But we can't train your folks on the type trench box they use, the type soil it is, or anything like that. Um, Now, we can hang around and watch you do that and make recommendations after the training, which I've done a few times. But it's a two-step process. What the standard says and the hands-on training to make sure people know how to do that. Now, if anyone has any questions, and if you run across any problems with the links on here, you are more than welcome to give me a shout. I'll put my email address and number up here again, just so you make sure you have it. Don't hesitate giving us a call to ask questions. We're here to help you, and we're here to also help you get trained on this stuff as well. Um, so thank you all for showing up, and I will be signing off right now. I didn't think I missed any questions, but if I did, drop me an email. And I want to say thanks for saying all the good comments to us at the end of these presentations and stuff. All right, I am going to go ahead and stop the recording.